The only time this much havoc had been wreaked by this few number of people, you need to go all the way back to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. One promo started it all. One promo on TBS started it all. One night, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, J.J. Dillon, Ole Anderson, and the Nature Boy Ric Flair were all on television together and had all the gold. And the reason for that random pairing or random combination was to save time at the end of the show. But when Arn Anderson said the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse line and stuck up four fingers, the rest, as they say, was history. Prior to that night, Ric Flair had associated himself with the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Arn Anderson and Ole Anderson, as a family member to the Andersons. Prior to that night, J.J. Dillon and Tully Blanchard really had little to no association with Flair, Arn, and Ole. But that all changed the night the Horseman was born. Ric Flair and Ole had been in the Mid-Atlantic territory since the mid-70s. Flair being brought in at the behest of Wahoo McDaniel, Ole being there with Gene and Lars Anderson for a long time, almost as a homesteader. Tully came in from Texas after working for his father as one half of the dynamic duo with Gino Hernandez. Arn was brought in thanks to the Junkyard Dog, while Arn was working in Mid-South for Bill Watts. JYD made a point to mention how much Arn looked like the Andersons. And because of that passing phrase and that passing sentence, Arn Anderson was brought into the Mid-Atlantic territory, and the rest, again, as they say, was history. It didn't take long for the group, the most powerful group in wrestling, to find their first victim, and that was Dusty Rhodes. The feud between the Horsemen and the American Dream is stuff of legend. From them jumping Dusty and breaking his leg outside of the arena, and just their work with the Road Warriors, with the Rock and Roll, with Magnum. There is a reason why people point to 1984 to 1987 in the Mid-Atlantic region as the height of professional wrestling, and I don't mean WWE, I mean real professional wrestling. It is because of people like the Horsemen, and Dusty Rhodes, and the Road Warriors, and the Midnights, and the Rock and Roll, etc., etc., etc. The first crack in the foundation of the Horsemen came when Ole Anderson wanted to step away and spend more time with his family. So they ousted Ole, who became a babyface for the first time that I can remember in the Mid-Atlantic territory, and Lex Luger joins the fray and becomes a Horseman. This prompts Luger's push up the card, and the second incarnation of the Horseman. The third incarnation would come in 1988 when Barry Windham comes in and joins the Horsemen in favor of Lex Luger. The one thing to point out is, with Barry in and Luger in, the team changed from Ole and Arn to Tully and Arn. And Luger would pursue the singles title instead of Tully pursuing the singles title, even though Tully was the one who groomed Magnum for the Magnum's feud with Flair that never came. Still, Tully and Arn became one of the most dominant forces in all of professional wrestling and are still considered one of the best tag teams ever in professional wrestling. Barry Windham at the time was one of the most athletically gifted wrestlers in the world, and if you wanted to take the phrase best pure athlete in the world, not best wrestler, best pure professional wrestler, best pure wrestler in the world, it was no doubt about it. About half the people that were working in the business at the time would have said Barry Windham. You can ask anybody. Flair had his strong points, Hogan had his strong points, this person had his strong points, that person had their strong points, but Barry Windham was perfection. He was born to be a professional wrestler. But Barry Windham in the Horseman, it didn't last. Because less than a year after Windham joins the Horseman, 7 months from Barry joins the Horseman in April of '88. By November, not only is WCW now under Turner Broadcasting's control after Crockett sold the promotion, but soon after, Arn and Tully head up north. Soon after, Arn and Tully head to the WWE, ending what could have been one of the best tag team feuds of a generation between the Horsemen and the Midnight Express, because Jim Cornette and the Midnights had always been the hottest heels in the promotion, and then they were turning babyface because of their feud with the Horsemen. Or I might even be wrong with that, and they weren't turning babyface, and it was just some fans like the Horsemen, some fans like the Midnight. But either way, it was one of the more interesting parts of Mid-Atlantic television at the time, and we just never got a payoff, because Arn and Tully left. After they left WWE, the Horsemen left WCW, because without Tully, what would have been the Horsemen? Ric Flair and another grouping? You couldn't have the Horsemen with half the original members gone. It needed to be something else, and that's why Ric Flair moved on. And he and Barry actually started being managed by Hiro Matsuda, because soon after Arn and Tully left, so did JJ. And yes, you might say Hiro Matsuda. Yes, if you're wondering, Hiro Matsuda actually did not know how to talk English. And even though there's nothing wrong with that, it kind of defeats the purpose of having Flair in a group instead of on his own if his manager does not add to his promos and just adds a menacing figure behind him, even though at the time, if I remember correctly, Hiro Matsuda was more of a Harley Race type or a Paul Heyman type that did not get involved in matches. But I could be wrong. But it's just, the pairing didn't fit is what I'm saying. Rewind to before Arn and Tully left, to February 1988, the first Clash of Champions. The year prior, Jim Crockett Promotions purchased Bill Watts' Universal Wrestling Federation for $4 million. And one of the people that they brought in from the UWF was Sting. Less than a year into his run with the WCW with Jim Crockett Promotions, Sting is in the main event of Clash of Champions against the Nature Boy Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight title and goes to a time limit draw with the champ. And it isn't one of those cases where Flair looked weak, or Sting looked too strong, or Sting was overrated, or this or that. It was more along the lines of, it was equal, and it was a star-making performance by the Stinger. It was the match that made Sting, Sting. And it was the match that made Sting and Flair adversaries for the next 20 years. But after Flair left, after Arn and Tully left, the Horsemen fell on dark times. The Horsemen became a distant memory until 1991, when Nature Boy Ric Flair returned. And even though the initial plan was, in '89, was to bring Arn and Tully back and have Arn and Tully and reform the Horsemen with Arn, Tully, and likely Barry Windham and Ric Flair, it didn't happen because of Jim Herd. But for that, go look at Jim Cornette videos and have him tell you the story. Because you're going to need to fast forward to the early 1990s, specifically around 1991 or 1992. Actually, 1993, I would put it at, because Flair did not return until early 93 to the WCW, when the Horseman was reformed and Paul Roma was the fourth member. And even though Paul Roma had a decent track record of being a good, solid hand in the ring, he did not fit the Horseman. He wasn't Horseman material. It just didn't work. It worked as well as Sting being in the Horseman. It worked as well as Sid Vicious being in the Horseman, which happened actually before, which actually happened after Arn Anderson returned, because they wanted a Horseman reformation, and even though they wanted Tully, Ole had been back, so Ole came back to television and filled in the spot that was once occupied by J.J. Dillon, who is now up in WWF, and the other two members were Sid and Sting. Sid didn't fit the Horseman because he was a muscle man, and you might say Luger was similar to Sid, or Sid was similar to Luger, but at least Luger could work in his prime. Sid never could. Sid was good at what he did best, but he was too limited in what he could do good, or what he could do well. Sting, on the other hand, had just feuded with Flair the year before, and didn't really fit in because it was too soon for a heel turn. It was too soon. I mean, they were babyface, but it was too soon for that formation of, it was too soon for that, connection, I guess is the best way to put it. And then once Barry Windham returned and Sting was out, it was Barry Windham, Sid, Ole as the manager, Flair, and Arn. Sting had been kicked out when they finally realized that the Horsemen are meant to be heels. After Sting challenged Flair for the belt, Sting wanted to be on his own. Sting deserved to be on his own. That's what I'm saying. That's why Sting, in my opinion, never fit the Horseman. And then you had another babyface run for the Horseman, but it fell apart again. And then for 2 years, there was no Horseman in WCW. There was no Horseman in the Mid-Atlantic region until Flair and Arn, back to being heels, became collectively known as the Horsemen, because they were the only true cogs. They were the only true associates. They were the only true members that actually mattered. And even though it was by far one of the best build-ups to the return of the Horseman, because you thought you were seeing, for the first time ever, Arn Anderson and Ric Flair feud with one another. As it turned out, Flair ended up turning on his longtime rival Sting in the middle of a tag team match against Arn Anderson and Brian Pillman to join up with Arn Anderson and Brian Pillman, and that led to one of the greatest reactions and one of the hottest runs for the Horsemen, in my opinion, because they were something different again. They fit. Pillman fit with the Horsemen. Benoit fit with the Horsemen. And even though early on, before the NWO started, there was one thing set in stone. There was one constant again in WCW, and that was the Four Horsemen. Because it was Flair's feud with Savage that helped turn the business around for WCW and set the stage for 1996 when the NWO showed up and changed everything. But again, this incarnation of the Horsemen was not built to last, because Brian Pillman went off on his own again. And instead of having the set tag team, the set singles guy, and Flair in the main event, they had 3 singles guys with no clear identity. And then once Pillman started breaking off on his own, and the writing was on the wall, and everything started to change. With Pillman going to ECW and then leaving to go to WWF, shit really hit the fan for the Horsemen, because they started falling apart. And then after being made to look like jokes in a handicap match against Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, and then feuding with the Dungeon of Doom, which led to an actual that really helped rehab both teams, because it was this feud with the Dungeon of Doom is what led to Benoit versus Sullivan, which controversy aside was one of the best feuds at the time in the company, because it really helped put Benoit on the map in his new home. And then you fast forward to June 96, where we see the first taste of Steve Mongo McMichael, as he and Kevin Green fight Arn Anderson and Ric Flair. And then it turns out Mongo joins the Horsemen to complete the Horsemen. And even though the Horsemen were babyfaces, and to say Mongo was not at least over would probably be an exaggeration, and Mongo was not at least decent in the ring, well, Mongo comparable to Paul Roma, in my opinion. But in fighting with the Horsemen, and just being babyfaces for that matter, led to them just being made to look like second-class citizens in the NWO. And then Jeff Jarrett wanted to join the Horsemen after he returned in 1997. Jeff Jarrett wanted to join the Horsemen in 1997, and to a degree, he was allowed into the group, but never officially enshrined in the group, and never inducted into the group, and was just used as a piece to give Mongo something to do, or add to the tension between the Horsemen. But again, alas, WCW did not know what they had and what people wanted, because the Horsemen were WCW. The Horseman was WCW. And then in 1997, August 1997 to be exact, Arn Anderson officially retired from the ring due to injury and gave his spot to Curt Hennig in one of the most emotional promos in history. Because how many times did you hear or did you see somebody actually cut a promo and retire on the air and mean it? Hennig would then turn on the Horsemen and join the New World Order in the War Games match, severely injuring Ric Flair in that contest in storyline, and Flair would never get his comeuppance because, again, babyface, not a heel. Fast forward to 1998 and the return of the Horsemen. And this led to the most questionable run for the Horsemen, with it being back with 4 guys and a manager like it had been in its original incarnation back in the 80s, with Arn Anderson now serving as the manager after being after being preached to by Benoit and Malenko and J.J. Dillon had been requesting to Arn to reform the Horsemen, and he finally gave in with Malenko, Benoit, McMichael, and Arn, and one piece was missing. Flair. Flair was the one that was missing. And the Nature Boy finally appeared, and this was one of the highest rated Nitros from the dark time, and might have been the last time that they actually won the ratings battle with the WWE. Again, proving WCW didn't know how important the Horseman was, and how they could have rode out the Horsemen and given them one last run. The Horsemen would then turn heel and get back together in 1999 with Flair, Arn, Malenko, Benoit, and Charles Robinson, as well as Asia and David Flair in the group. But, again, not built to last. The problem is, or the point is, the 4 Horsemen paved the way for heel stables, for innovating and popularizing the concept of the heel faction, of what it meant to be cool, what it meant to be like the most talked about person in the room, what it meant to have a group of the best collective a wrestling promotion could have. The best in-ring competitors in the business, all in one place. And there is no doubt about it that Jim Ross's quote that he stated on the 4 Horsemen DVD back in 2007, without the Horsemen, there would damn sure be no NWO or no D-Generation X. And that is, without a shadow of a doubt, fact. Just like if Tully Blanchard would have been able to return in 1989 or 1993, things would have been completely different for the WCW. But because of ego, and because of bitterness, and because of unwillingness to see how important this faction was to the legacy of the WCW, to the meaning, to the identity of WCW, nobody realized what it meant. Nobody realized the importance it would have. The importance it could have, and the importance that it did have to business in WCW. That any time the Horsemen were given the reins, the Horsemen popped business every single time. And I'll even go as far to say there is no evolution without the Horsemen. Simple as that. And that is why it is with great pleasure that I have chosen to induct the 4 Horsemen into the Hall of Fame of Wrestling Express and finally cap off the 2020 class, the 2020 Hall of Fame class. It took me long enough, I know, but either way, the Horsemen are the first faction to get inducted into the Hall of Fame. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on the greatest faction in the history of professional wrestling. Until next time, see you later.